Good evening, everyone. My name is Omar Borges, and my case study is called Prominent Deviance. For the purposes of this case, study, the name of the police officer, town that he works in, and specific locations were created for the purposes of jurisdictional law issues and to create a better flow to the project. The following is a brief summary of case study Prominent Deviance, Section 4, Case 6. Police Officer John Smith works for the Dedham Police Department on the first half shift, which are between the hours of 3 p.m. and 11 p.m. Officer Smith's current assignment is the walking beat at Barnes Memorial Park, located at 131 Eastern Avenue in Dedham. The town of Dedham is a small town compared to its neighbor, the city of Boston. Since it is early spring and the weather is nice, the park is filled with children, teenagers, and the occasional drug and alcohol issues as a result of people gathering, especially during the weekends. On one evening, Officer Smith was approached by a young girl in her early teens who was visibly upset. The young girl advised the officer that a man tried to attack her little brother in one of the public restrooms located inside the park. The girl then proceeds to bring Officer Smith to a nearby bench where he locates her little brother and an older boy. The girl advises the officer that the little boy is her brother, whose name is Adam, and the older boy is her boyfriend, whose name is Travis. The officer observes that Adam wasn't as frantic as his older sister and asks him if everything was okay. Adam advised the officer that he was approached by a man inside of the restroom and that the man wanted to touch him and offered him money in the process. Adam continues to state that he has never seen the man before and didn't know him. Travis tells the officer that he was sitting with his girlfriend on the park bench when Adam came running from the public restroom area. Adam then told them what had happened, and Travis proceeded toward the bathrooms to locate the unknown man. Travis said he couldn't locate anyone, and his girlfriend then proceeded to look for the officer. Officer Smith then proceeded to begin his investigation and starting noting identification information from Adam. The victim advised the officer that he was 10 years of age and that he will turn 11 next month. The victim described the suspect as an older man in his 40s, big, fat, black hair, and balding on top. Officer Smith gathered all other pertinent information and advised everyone that if they see this man again, to contact the police. After this interaction, Officer Smith continued his patrol of the park to locate this unknown man. At the end of his shift that day, Officer Smith relayed the information of the incident to the oncoming officers for the next shift, so they would be aware of the situation. The new officers advised Officer Smith that they received a similar report last month of a woman who complained that a man attempted to pick up her little boy in the park restroom. Officer Smith asked the officer if he wrote a report, and the officer stated that he did not, that he didn't believe it was important at the time because the woman wasn't visibly upset and the man just tried to pick up the boy. The next morning, Officer Smith arrived early for his shift and took the opportunity to review similar reports and complaints that may have been made. He located 2 reports of attempted sexual molestation of young boys in the park from last summer. Officer Smith notices that the description on those 2 reports matched the description given by Adam the previous day. Officer Smith decides to watch the bathroom closely during his shift that day. It begins to get darker, so he decides to walk into the public bathroom and into a stall so that he can go undetected. For the next 30 minutes, Officer Smith notices people going in and out of the bathroom, but nothing stands out to him. He starts to think that Him hiding in a bathroom stall begins to look odd and doesn't want to be perceived as a deviant himself, and decides that it's time for him to continue his patrol. Just before exiting the stall, Officer Smith observed two young boys enter the bathroom around the ages of 10 and 12. Within a few seconds, he observes a third individual enter the bathroom, but from his point of view, can only see the individual's back. Officer Smith notices that the man matches the description from the police reports. The man proceeds to ask the young boys their names, and they respond, Donnie and Giles. The man then asks the young boys if they would like to make $10. One of the boys replies, "What do we have to do?" The man replies, "Just something that would make us both feel good." Officer Smith then sees the man begin to hold and fondle one of the boys. Officer Smith immediately jumps out of the stall and confronts the unknown man. Officer Smith now realizes that the man in question is Wayne Tussle, who is a prominent citizen in the town of Dedham. Mr. Tussle is a member of the school board, alderman on the city council, and serves several community organizations in the town of Dedham. Mr. Tussle is now visibly shaking and perspiring heavily. Officer Smith gathers the victim's information and tells the victims to wait outside of the bathroom. Officer Smith attempts to advise Mr. Tussle of his rights, but is cut off. Mr. Tussle, in a panic, explains to the officer that he can't afford any negative publicity. Mr. Tussle explains to the officer that he has a wife and two daughters, and that he is seeking professional help from Dr. Anders in Bakerville. At this point, Officer Smith ponders the situation. The officer is aware that Dr. Anders is a well-known psychiatrist in the next town over, and sees that Mr. Tussle is remorseful. Officer Smith wonders if Mr. Tussle is telling the truth or just lying to be freed. Questions are now raised in the officer's mind whether anyone was physically or emotionally hurt. If an arrest is made, what would be the ripple effect throughout the town of Dedham? Since Mr. Tussle is such a prominent figure, can his treatment with the doctor cure his deviance? Or is it going to continue if he is let go? The officer's initial reaction is to immediately arrest him. But he wants to make the right decision and not let his emotions get the best of him. Will the officer face any backlash or pressure from the community if an arrest is made? The answer here is quite simple. Officer Smith should request an ambulance to respond and evaluate the two young victims and immediately place Mr. Tussle under arrest. No one is above the law. A crime was committed in the presence of the officer, and an arrest should be made immediately. The crime committed is egregious, and the excuses provided by Mr. Tussle are not valid and quite pompous. The incident describes Mr. Tussle as holding and fondling one of the young boys. It doesn't particularly state what part of the body Mr. Tussle was fondling, but it's implied by his statement that it was an act that would make them both feel good. At minimum, within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Mr. Tussle should be arrested for the charge of indecent assault and battery on a child under the age of 14, which falls under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 265, Section 13B, which is a felony in this state. The victim was not yet 14 years of age at the time of the incident, and the act that was committed by Mr. Tussle is considered indecent. In Massachusetts, a child under the age of 14 is presumed incapable of providing consent. According to the state law, the term indecent is an act fundamentally offensive. The assault and battery of a person becomes indecent when portions of the anatomy commonly thought as private are touched. Regardless, if the victim's body is touched over or under the clothes. Even though Mr. Tussle stated just something that would make us both feel good, the act does not require that sexual statements are made prior to the touching for it to be considered indecent in nature. If convicted of this crime, Mr. Tussle could face a maximum of 10 years in a state prison or minimum 2.5 years in a house of corrections. Since there are 3 other victims that have been reported within the last year, Mr. Tussle should face the maximum penalty for his crimes. Any indecent assault and battery is a heinous crime. But when it includes children under the age of 14 who are not able to consent, it becomes unforgivable. Mr. Tussle's addiction and sickness could possibly be reversed with treatment, but that doesn't change the narrative. A crime was committed, and Mr. Tussle should pay for his unlawful deeds, just like any other normal resident of Dedham. On May 16, 2018, a gym teacher by the name of Nicholas Speller at the Patrick J. Kennedy Elementary School in East Boston was arrested and charged with 4 counts of indecent assault and battery on a child under the age of 14. Mr. Speller is not as prominent as our suspect from the case study, but does hold a position of trust and importance. Mr. Speller is innocent until proven guilty, but this is an example of how the position you hold shouldn't affect whether you get arrested or not. Nobody is above the law. Individuals in sensitive positions like this should be held to a higher standard. The first interview I conducted pertaining to this case study, was of Boston Police Sergeant Detective Joseph Sullivan. Sergeant Sullivan is a 24-year veteran of the force and has been assigned to various investigative units during his career. As it pertained to this case study, Sergeant Sullivan believed that certain facts were vague, that the case study didn't go into detail when it pertained to the sexual act committed by Mr. Tussle. He believed he needed a little bit more detail as it pertained to the accusation of fondling and holding. Though he believed that we could make assumptions on the case study that Mr. Tussle should have been arrested for indecent assault and battery on a child under 14. Sergeant Sullivan also believed that the officer improperly handled the initial investigation of the first victim, Adam. The responsibility of a first responder to any attempted or completed sexual assault should be to gather basic details of the case and then request a detective to respond to the scene. Sergeant Sullivan believed that the officer handled the first report of an attempted sexual assault in a nonchalant manner. Sergeant Sullivan believed that if Mr. Tussle was arrested and convicted of the crime, that he should be penalized by whatever the court deemed reasonable. He also informed me that he believes Mr. Tussle needs more help than just a psychiatrist, but that shouldn't interfere with the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office from conducting a full investigation into his actions. After the conclusion of this interview, I realized that we had similar views when it pertained to Mr. Tussle being immediately arrested. Also, to the fact that certain details of this case were vague at best. Though we did differ when it came to punishment if Mr. Tussle was indeed convicted. I believe that if convicted, it should be the harshest punishment and not what the court deemed reasonable. The second interview I conducted pertaining to this case study was of Boston Police Undercover Drug Officer Nicholas Fisher. Officer Fisher is an 8-year veteran of the force and has responded to numerous 911 calls for sexual assaults within the city of Boston. As it pertained to this case, Officer Fisher believed that the political background and clout of Mr. Tussle has no bearing in what Officer Smith should decide. That the only option is an immediate arrest and investigation into the previous sexual assault allegations possibly committed by the same suspect. Officer Fisher found that the mere fact that Officer Smith was debating and pondering his options to whether to make an arrest shows that he shouldn't be an officer for the town of Dedham. It showed him that Officer Smith has preconceived notions and biases that are not allowing him to properly perform his duties as a police officer. Officer Fisher believed that Mr. Tussle should be fully tried and convicted for his crimes and be punished for such heinous offenses. Officer Fisher believed that Mr. Tussle, if convicted, could receive the help that he needs from trained professionals within the state penitentiary or House of Corrections. After the conclusion of this interview, I found that Officer Fisher touched on some key aspects that I may have overlooked. Like the fact that Officer Smith was contemplating his next move and not just making the right move as an officer. The fact that Officer Smith could have had some biases that were interfering with his ability to properly perform his duties. We shared the same opinion that Mr. Tussle should be convicted and thrown in prison with the maximum sentence. Officer Fisher also had the idea that Mr. Tussle could receive the help he needed, but be convicted for his crimes and be properly punished as well. The third and final interview I conducted was of Boston Police Detective Eric Murner. Detective Murner is a 9-year veteran of the force who has held many different positions within the Boston Police Department. As it pertains to this case study, Detective Murner believes that Mr. Tussle should have been arrested and brought back to the station for a more thorough interview. The parents of the victims should have been immediately notified in both instances, and an ambulance requested for an evaluation. Detective Murner believed if Mr. Tussle was arrested and convicted, that his punishment should be the full force possible of the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office. Detective Murner believed that Mr. Tussle could be treated for his addiction, but should be placed in a state penitentiary for his crimes. He believed that there is no excuse on this earth that justifies child molestation. This was the only interview of the 3 that I fully agreed with what was said. We had similar beliefs and thoughts and believed that Mr. Tussle should be fully held accountable for his actions, no matter what he was or what he did. So I pose these questions to my audience. Does the fact that Mr. Tussle hold a position of power entitle him to preferential treatment by the Dedham Police Department? Does the town of Dedham support Mr. Tussle until he is proven guilty, or are they allowed to make assumptions prior to his trial? And with the final, and I'll leave you with this final question. Does the fact that Mr. Tussle admitting he is seeking help from his doctor, is it the same as an admission of guilt? Thank you. Just end it.